Leader McConnell and I don't agree on everything. In fact, we disagree on a lot of things. But here's what matters. He's a man of his word. When he gives you his word, you can take it to the bank, you can count on it, and he's willing to find common ground to get things done for the country. So thank you, Mitch. Thank you. We can work together. We can get things done. We can move the nation forward. We just drop a little bit of our egos and focus on what is needed in the country.
If you look at the political alignment of everyone involved in this, it's the government working together to solve a major problem at a time when the country needs to see examples like this of coming together and getting an outcome.
Wow.
That is a contrast.
Boy,
President Biden in Kentucky yesterday,
contrast.
along with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, to tout the administration's infrastructure bill. The bill supplied $1.6 billion to replace a crumbling bridge that connects southern Ohio to northern Kentucky. Also at the event was Republican Governor Mike DeWine, Kentucky's Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, and Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who joins us now. So looking just at those pictures, would love to hear more about the event yesterday and what it portends for the future. But it didn't really seem like what one member of the House was describing as the President Obama JV team in Washington. That looked like a pretty good team led by Joe Biden yesterday.
Well, yeah, thanks, Mika. And look at the contrast, Willie, earlier, I think all of you pointed out the contrast of look at the House floor and look what Mitch McConnell and President Biden and it's hard for me to say former Senator Foreman, he's only been out of office 2 days, and I were doing at that bridge, and Governor Beshear from Kentucky. And I mean, look at this. This is the biggest, I believe it's the biggest investment in one project from federal dollars, perhaps ever. It's 3% of GDP goes that bridge, but it's also look back. It's what bipartisanship looks like. We did the PACT Act to provide health care for those soldiers and those men and women who serve us who were exposed to the burn pits in Iraq. Look at the CHIPS Act. We're finally doing an industrial policy in our country, rebuilding supply chains. That was done bipartisanly. And again, that's what we're there for. And that's what the celebration was so wonderful about yesterday in Cincinnati. We're actually in Kentucky, but then we went to Cincinnati. I'd like to point out, and all of you that know Cincinnati, point out you want to do the event on the other side, on the Kentucky side, because then the camera looks into the background is the beautiful skyline in Cincinnati, rather than doing it the other way around. But that's a little bit of a bio continue. I'll let that go. So
you're a producer. You're a producer. You've got a future in it. It's so interesting when you look at how this Congress began on January the 6th, 2021. No one would have predicted 2 years later that Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden and Governor DeWine and Senator Sherrod Brown and Beshear, and you name it, all of these people would be coming together. But it really does underline a lot larger fact, bigger fact. You guys, Republicans and Democrats alike, were able to accomplish more in a bipartisan way over the last 2 years than anybody would have predicted. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the joys of this job and what we've been able to do. I heard people say, and a lot of people say, this is the most productive Senate, House, and presidency since the Great Society and LBJ days. Some say since FDR and the New Deal. And it was, as I said, it was the CHIPS Act, which is going to mean a real industrial policy nationally. It's working with veterans. It was fixing, some of them were a little more partisan, fixing the pension program. So a million workers who had lost their pensions will get them, the child tax credit, a number of things we did with the Inflation Reduction Act on climate change. But it was a productive time, sometimes bipartisan, not always, but productive nonetheless. And that's what you elect us for. And I spent more time with Mitch McConnell yesterday. We talked about everything from the farm bill that we're going to team up on. He's on the ag committee with me, to what we might do to how in housing and what we can do on a whole host of other things. So it was just a good trip all the way around. It's what government service should be about, not what they're doing in Washington whenever this ends with Kevin McCarthy.
Senator Brown, this is Eddie Glaude. Thank you for your service in so many ways. I want to ask this question about bipartisanship. There's this view that bipartisanship somehow comes with the compromise of one's principles. It's clear who you are, where your politics are. How do you present bipartisanship as not being a compromise of basic principles that define how you see yourself as a public servant?
That's exactly the right question. And Rob Portman and Rob rode out on the plane with us, and I spent, as Rob was just one day out of office at that point yesterday, and we talked about the difference between compromise and the better way to understand it, I think, is finding common ground. And Rob and I are very different. I mean, he was for every trade agreement. I was against every trade agreement. He was for the Trump tax cut for rich people, as I would say. I was against him, on all the major issues. But we found common ground, everything from what we did for Lake Erie, what we do for NASA Glenn, what we do at Wright Pat, what we do to help Columbus and Central Ohio and the CHIPS Act. I mean, that's my job, is not to compromise, and even whatever moving to the center, whatever all that stuff means, because I don't see politics as left or right particularly, but it's finding common ground. What can we agree on? Roy Blunt, also, who just retired from Missouri. I've known Roy for 40 years. He one time said, Sherrod Brown and I agreed on exactly 5 things in our career. And then he laughs and he said, but all 5 of them are now federal law. And that's what you do. You seek out I seek out Republicans with whom I agree very little, but I find things we agree on, and that the common ground, and that's what good public officials do.
So, Senator, yesterday you were at the bridge looking back at Cincinnati, and you mentioned the CHIPS Act, you mentioned burn pits, you mentioned, obviously you were there, the bridge that was built, part of a legislation package. You were just talking about the child care tax credit. You're up for re-election in 2024 in a Republican state. You're a staunch Democrat. How do Democrats grow their popularity in states that lean to Republicans? How do Democrats behave and act and get more things that people can touch, feel, and see that impact their lives?
Well, you do really what Eddie and I were just talking about. You find common ground. The PACT Act, I'm going to be in Toledo today and in Sandusky as soon as this show's over. I'll head west, and we'll be talking to veterans about those issues. And I will be talking about Lake Erie issues that really don't know a party label. I think there's but it's as you know, Mike, it starts with listening to what people's concerns are. And I think we all talk too much and don't listen enough. Certainly not people in this show, but those of us in public office. But I think you start with that, and you can see. I mean, my state is a 60% pro-choice state. I am convinced that maybe it's a 70% pro-choice state. I will always have for 30 years. For 25 years have been for marriage equality. I will not compromise on those issues. They are so important. They're human rights, they're civil rights, they're worker rights. And if you talk about the dignity of work and you talk about worker rights, it's not, are you left or right or middle or Democrat or Republican? It's whose side are you on? And I win because I do better among working class voters than perhaps certainly in any Democrat in this part of the country. And I think I do because I always lead talking about workers and worker rights and being on the side of workers.
All right, Senator Sherrod Brown, thank you very much. So it is.